As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history.
The palace wasn't supposed to see this letter. It wasn't meant for history, and it definitely wasn't meant for King Charles III. But once he read it, everything changed. Witnesses say he stopped mid-sentence, stared at the page, and quietly broke down. The words inside didn't attack him. They exposed a decision that could collapse Queen Camilla's position overnight. This letter didn't argue. It proved, and the timing was no accident. Someone waited years for this moment. The question is simple. Who sent it? And why now? Stay tuned as we uncover the details behind this letter. The night the palace fell silent. Rain hammered against the towering windows of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III sat alone in his private study, the weight of the crown seeming heavier than it had ever felt since his coronation. The palace guards stood with unusual tension in their shoulders, whispering among themselves about why His Majesty had dismissed every advisor and secretary hours earlier, demanding absolute solitude in a manner that suggested something catastrophic was unfolding behind closed doors. Charles looked older than his years that night, his face drawn and pale under the soft glow of the desk lamp, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the polished mahogany surface that had witnessed countless royal decisions over generations. The exhaustion etched into every line of his face told the story of a man who had carried impossible burdens for far too long, who had sacrificed more than anyone knew to reach this position, only to discover that the throne offered no protection from the demons that had pursued him throughout his life. Outside his locked door, the palace hummed with its usual nocturnal activity. Staff preparing for tomorrow's engagements, security making their rounds, the machinery of monarchy grinding forward regardless of whatever personal crisis consumed the king. But inside that study, time seemed to have stopped completely. A sealed envelope lay before him on the desk, delivered through channels that had bypassed every security protocol and every screening process that normally protected the monarch from unauthorized correspondence. There was no royal crest embossed in wax on the seal, no official letterhead, no return address that would identify its sender or origin. The handwriting on the front was familiar enough to make Charles's stomach clench with recognition, yet foreign enough to fill him with a dread he could not rationally explain. He had been staring at that envelope for nearly an hour, his hand reaching for it repeatedly before pulling back, some instinct warning him that once he broke that seal and read what lay inside, his life would never be the same. He thought to himself that some things once known could never be unknown, that certain truths had the power to destroy everything a person had built over a lifetime. His fingers finally moved to the envelope, breaking the seal with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence, and he pulled out several sheets of heavy paper that smelled faintly of age and deliberate preservation. The first paragraph struck him like a physical blow, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes moved across words that seemed impossible, that contradicted everything he thought he understood about his marriage and his wife's position within the monarchy. His hands began shaking so violently that the paper rattled audibly, and he had to set it down on the desk before he dropped it entirely. A single sentence near the bottom of that opening page made his vision blur, made the room spin around him, made him grip the edge of his desk to steady himself against a wave of nausea and disorientation. He read that sentence again, then a third time, each repetition making it more real and more devastating, forcing him to confront a reality he had never imagined possible. The letter was not what he had expected, not a blackmail attempt, not a personal grievance, not even a political attack from enemies who had never accepted his marriage to Camilla. This was something far more dangerous, far more institutional, far more capable of destroying everything they had built together over decades of struggle and sacrifice. Charles set the letter down with trembling hands and closed his eyes, trying to process what he had just learned, trying to understand how something this explosive could have remained hidden for so long and why it was surfacing now, at this particular moment in his reign. The walls of his study seemed to press inward. the air growing thick and hard to breathe, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling hostile and confining. He realized with terrible clarity that this letter was not asking him to make a choice between competing loyalties or difficult options. It was simply informing him of what was about to happen, of consequences that had been set in motion long before the envelope reached his desk. By dawn, everything would change, and the monarchy he had inherited just months earlier would never be the same. The reign that Camilla had fought so desperately to secure, that she had endured decades of public hatred to achieve, that had seemed finally stable and legitimate after years of careful rehabilitation. All of it was about to crumble, and there was nothing Charles could do to prevent it. The letter. No one was supposed to see. The letter claimed to document a secret agreement reached in the years before Charles's marriage to Camilla, an arrangement negotiated between palace advisors and Camilla herself regarding the conditions under which she would be accepted into the royal family. Charles's hands clenched involuntarily as he read descriptions of meetings he had never been told about, conversations that had apparently taken place without his knowledge or consent, decisions made about his life and his future while he was deliberately kept in the dark. The letter stated that Camilla had been given a choice by representatives of the monarchy. She could marry Charles and eventually become his queen, but only if she agreed to specific restrictions on her power, her influence, and her ability to shape the institution she was entering. According to the letter, she had accepted those terms without hesitation, desperate enough for legitimacy that she would have agreed to almost anything in exchange for the position she had craved for so long. The specific terms outlined in the letter made Charles feel physically ill as he absorbed their implications and understood what they meant for his current situation. Camilla had apparently agreed that her position would always be conditional, subject to review if she overstepped boundaries that were clearly defined in documentation that Charles had never seen. She had promised to remain largely ceremonial, to avoid attempting to influence policy or succession matters, to accept that her role would always be subordinate in ways that went beyond normal protocol. Most devastatingly, she had agreed that if she violated these terms, or if her presence became politically problematic for reasons beyond her control, she could be removed from her position without Charles having any say in the decision. The letter indicated that these agreements had been documented, signed, and sealed, stored in archives that were not controlled by the palace, but by other institutions within the British establishment that had their own interests in maintaining monarchical stability. Charles read these passages multiple times, unable to believe that Camilla would have agreed to such conditions, unable to reconcile this information with the strong, determined woman he thought he knew so well. The letter's language shifted from historical documentation to present-day consequences, explaining that Camilla had violated the terms of her agreement through actions that the letter detailed with damning specificity. She had attempted to influence matters of succession, had made decisions about palace operations that exceeded her authorized role, had built networks of loyalty among staff and advisors that the institution viewed as threatening to proper hierarchies. Whether these accusations were fair or exaggerated hardly mattered. What mattered was that they were documented, that evidence existed to support them, and that the people who controlled that evidence had decided the time had come to enforce consequences. Charles realized he was reading not a threat, but a notification, an explanation of actions that were already in motion regardless of his feelings about their justice or necessity. The letter stated clearly that this was not blackmail seeking his compliance with demands. It was simply professional courtesy, informing him of institutional decisions that had been made in rooms he had no access to by people whose power predated his crown and would outlast his reign. The constitutional language embedded in what otherwise read like personal correspondence made Charles understand that he was facing forces he could not overcome through will or position. The British monarchy survived through careful balance with other power structures: Parliament, the Church, the aristocracy, the military, the financial institutions that funded national operations. and those structures had their own requirements for stability and continuity. The letter suggested that Camilla had become a liability in the eyes of people who controlled access to resources and legitimacy that even a king depended on for effective rule. Charles set the letter down again, his mind racing through possible responses, searching desperately for some way to protect his wife from what was coming. He found nothing. Every option led to consequences that would damage the monarchy more severely than simply accepting what the letter demanded. He was trapped, caught between love and duty in ways that made his earlier conflicts seem trivial by comparison, and the crown that he had finally achieved after waiting longer than any heir in British history now felt like a prison rather than the culmination of his life's purpose. Camilla's rise and the compromise that built it. The letter shifted focus to Queen Camilla's extraordinary journey from the most despised woman in Britain to crowned queen sitting beside Charles at his coronation, a transformation that had required decades of patience and strategic image management. In the years following Princess Diana's death, Camilla had been subjected to hatred so intense and so public that she could barely appear in public without facing hostile crowds and vicious media attacks. Newspapers had published unflattering photographs deliberately. Opinion writers had questioned her character and her right to exist in Charles's life, and public opinion polls had shown overwhelming opposition to any possibility of her becoming queen. She had endured this torture with remarkable composure, understanding that time and consistency were her only weapons against a public that blamed her for Diana's unhappiness and viewed her as the villain in a royal romance that had captivated the world. The transformation from reviled mistress to accepted wife had not happened naturally or inevitably. It had been engineered through one of the most sophisticated public relations campaigns in modern royal history, with advisors carefully managing every appearance and every message to gradually shift public perception from hostile to neutral to grudgingly accepting. Behind the scenes, negotiations had taken place in private rooms where Camilla's fate was decided by men in expensive suits who represented institutions far older and more powerful than any individual monarch. These advisors had conducted careful analysis of the situation, understanding that Charles would not abandon Camilla regardless of public pressure or institutional preference, and therefore the only viable path forward involved finding ways to integrate her into the royal structure that minimized damage to the monarchy's reputation. They had feared instability above all else, terrified that another crisis involving Charles's love life might raise fundamental questions about whether the monarchy deserved continued public support and taxpayer funding. After extensive discussion and careful consideration of various scenarios, they had reached consensus that Camilla could be accepted, but only under conditions that protected the institution from the worst potential consequences of her presence. Someone had been designated to approach Camilla directly, to explain the reality of her situation with brutal honesty, to make clear that her path to legitimacy required accepting limitations that she might find humiliating, but that were absolutely non-negotiable. That meeting, which Charles had apparently never been informed about, had taken place in a private London location far from palace oversight, and Camilla had been told exactly what would be required of her if she wanted to marry Charles and eventually become his queen. The terms had been harsh, but not impossible. She would need to accept a subordinate role even after marriage, would need to avoid any appearance of trying to influence Charles's decisions on matters of state or succession, would need to understand that her position was being granted rather than earned, and could be revoked if she overstepped boundaries or became too politically controversial. She had been shown documentation of public opinion polling that demonstrated how deeply she was hated, had been told bluntly that one wrong move could trigger a crisis that might threaten the monarchy itself, had been made to understand that she was being offered a chance that she would never receive again if she rejected it now. According to the letter Charles now held, Camilla had agreed to everything without significant objection, signing documents that made her acceptance conditional and her position permanently insecure. She had calculated, apparently, that even a restricted position beside Charles was preferable to being permanently excluded from his life, and she had been willing to accept almost any terms in exchange for the legitimacy she had craved since their relationship first became public knowledge. The years following that secret agreement had seen Camilla learn to operate within the constraints that had been placed on her, developing skills of patience and strategic restraint that served her well in navigating royal life. She had been careful to remain in the background during Charles's official duties, had focused her public efforts on uncontroversial charitable causes, had avoided any statement or action that could be interpreted as attempting to compete with Diana's memory or to claim influence beyond what had been authorized. The public gradually became accustomed to her presence at Charles's side, and the absence of new scandals or controversies slowly eroded the intensity of opposition that had once seemed insurmountable. Palace communications staff had worked tirelessly to present her as dignified and appropriate, releasing carefully staged photographs and managing her public appearances with meticulous attention to detail. By the time Charles became king, the groundwork had been laid for Camilla to assume the title of Queen Consort without triggering the massive public backlash that would have been inevitable just a decade earlier. She had believed, or allowed herself to believe, that her successful performance over so many years had earned her a security that transcended whatever agreements had been made when she was desperate and powerless. That belief, Charles now understood, had been completely wrong, and the crown Camilla wore with such apparent confidence was built on foundations far more fragile than either of them had realized. The institution had never truly accepted her. It had simply calculated that tolerating her presence cost less than the instability that would result from Charles's emotional breakdown if she were permanently excluded. The moment that calculation changed, the moment that her presence became more costly than her absence, the agreements she had signed decades earlier would be enforced with ruthless efficiency. Charles felt a complex mixture of emotions as he absorbed this history: anger that such decisions had been made without his knowledge, grief that Camilla had faced such pressure alone, and betrayal that she had kept this secret from him for so many years. He wondered whether their entire marriage had been built on foundations he did not understand, whether the woman he loved had been playing a role he had never been allowed to see clearly. The letter had not just threatened Camilla's position, it had undermined Charles's understanding of his entire adult life, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about the relationship that had defined him for decades. When power shifts quietly. Palace staff noticed immediately that something was catastrophically wrong when dawn broke over London and the king's schedule began, though none of them could have articulated exactly what had changed in the atmosphere. Meetings that had been scheduled for weeks were suddenly cancelled without explanation through terse messages from the king's private secretary, leaving senior advisors confused and increasingly alarmed by the breakdown of normal operations. Security protocols governing access to the king's private quarters were adjusted in ways that restricted even the most trusted personnel from areas they had previously entered freely, creating visible tension among guards and staff who understood that such changes only happened in response to serious security concerns or personal crises. Charles summoned exactly 2 advisors to his study in the early morning hours, men whose positions and decades of loyal service made them uniquely qualified to hear what he had to share, and he instructed them explicitly that no written notes were to be taken during their conversation, that everything discussed must remain in their memories alone without documentation that might someday surface and create additional complications. The phrase "irreversible outcome" was spoken multiple times during that grim meeting, with Charles's voice hollow and defeated in ways that made both advisors profoundly uncomfortable despite their decades of experience handling royal crises. They understood gradually that they were discussing the monarchy's greatest institutional fear, which was not scandal in the traditional sense. The royal family had survived numerous scandals over centuries and would undoubtedly face more in the future, but precedent, the establishment of expectations or limitations that would constrain future monarchs in ways that might permanently weaken the institution. The British monarchy had survived by adapting slowly while appearing unchanging, making small concessions that seemed insignificant individually, but which cumulatively allowed the institution to remain relevant while other European monarchies crumbled or were abolished. What Charles described threatened to establish precedents about the limits of royal power and the conditions under which sitting monarchs could be compelled to take actions against their personal wishes. Precedents that would echo through future reigns and potentially undermine the carefully maintained fiction that the monarch still possessed meaningful authority. The discussion of possible responses was brief and unsatisfying, because once the full situation was explained with all its legal and institutional complexities, both advisors understood that meaningful choices did not really exist within the constraints Charles faced. Delay was theoretically possible, but would only extend the suffering without changing the fundamental outcome, because the people who had sent the letter controlled resources and documented evidence that would eventually force compliance regardless of how long Charles resisted. Denial was not viable as a strategy, because the agreements Camilla had signed were apparently documented and stored beyond palace control, protected by institutions that had their own interests in maintaining the validity of contracts and the reliability of their archives. The only path that preserved the monarchy as an effective institution was sacrifice, and all three men in that study understood without explicitly stating it that the sacrifice required was Camilla's position and influence, her reduction from active queen consort to ceremonial figurehead without real power or meaningful role. Camilla herself remained uninformed about the crisis unfolding around her through that first morning, and Charles chose silence when she asked cheerful questions over breakfast about his unusually early start and the succession of grim-faced advisors she had seen entering and leaving his study. She noticed the distance in his manner and the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly, but she attributed this to stress about upcoming diplomatic visits or political pressures that she knew consumed much of his attention as king. She did not understand yet that the ground was shifting beneath her feet, that decisions had been made in rooms she was not invited to enter, that her husband was being forced into a position where he would have to choose between her and his throne. The palace continued functioning around her with its usual efficiency, with servants and staff performing their duties without visible disruption. But among those few who had been informed of the situation, there was a new wariness in how they interacted with the Queen, a subtle pulling back that someone more paranoid might have noticed immediately. The section ended with an observation about temporal pressure and the impossibility of Charles's situation, noting that every minute he waited to begin implementing the required changes made the eventual outcome worse and more painful. The institution now knew about the crisis and expected resolution within time frames that Charles had no power to extend, and any appearance of the king prioritizing personal loyalty over institutional demands would create exactly the kind of precedent that the monarchy could not afford to establish. The clock was ticking toward an outcome that Charles desperately wanted to avoid, but lacked the power to prevent, and with each passing hour, more people within the palace and the broader establishment became aware that Camilla's reign was entering its terminal phase. The morning light that filled the palace corridors felt colder than usual to Charles as he walked them alone after his advisors departed, understanding that he was about to do something that would haunt him for whatever years remained in his reign, but which would cost him whatever fragments of personal happiness he had managed to preserve through decades of duty and institutional sacrifice. When Camilla realizes something is wrong, Camilla began noticing subtle changes in her environment over the following days, small shifts in behavior and protocol that individually meant little, but which collectively suggested something significant was happening outside her awareness or control. Charles became increasingly distant emotionally, even when physically present, not hostile or angry, but absent in ways that went beyond normal preoccupation with royal duties, as though his mind was consumed by burdens he could not or would not share with her. Advisors who normally sought her input on ceremonial matters and charitable initiatives began routing those questions through other channels, presenting her with finished decisions rather than involving her in deliberations as they had previously done. The invitations to private meetings and strategy sessions that had been part of her daily routine as queen consort became less frequent, then rare, then effectively non-existent, leaving her calendar emptier and her influence over palace affairs visibly diminished in ways that were never formally announced but which she could feel happening around her with increasing clarity. There was no direct confrontation where anyone sat her down and explained that her position was being systematically reduced, because that kind of explicit communication would have been both unnecessary given her intelligence and cruel in ways that violated the careful politeness that governed palace interactions. Instead, the changes happened through bureaucratic mechanisms and quiet redirections, through doors that no longer opened as easily for her, and phone calls that went unreturned slightly longer than etiquette normally allowed. Camilla sensed the shift in power dynamics with instincts she had developed over decades of navigating environments where she was barely tolerated, where her position depended entirely on reading subtle signals and understanding messages that were never spoken directly. She felt the palace pulling away from her in increments too small to protest individually, but too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, or her imagination running wild under stress. A private memory resurfaced during those days of growing isolation, a conversation she had years earlier with someone who had since died, someone who had told her bluntly that her acceptance was conditional and revocable, that powerful people had long memories about promises made and agreements signed. At the time, she had dismissed the warning as the bitter perspective of someone who resented her success in climbing to a position they believed she had no right to occupy, and she had convinced herself that time and competent performance would eventually make her position secure beyond challenge. Now, watching her influence drain away without anyone acknowledging what was happening, she remembered those words with new and terrible understanding, recognizing that she had been naive to believe that successful performance would earn her permanent security. The agreements she had signed when she was desperate and powerless, the concessions she had accepted in exchange for any form of legitimacy, had never been forgotten by the people who truly controlled access to power within the British establishment. They had simply been filed away, waiting for circumstances that would make their enforcement both necessary. She finally gathered courage to ask Charles a single direct question during a rare moment when they were alone together without staff or advisors hovering nearby, asking him simply whether she should be worried about her position and whether something had changed that he needed to tell her about. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to confront, and she watched his face carefully as he struggled to formulate a response. She saw the pain in his eyes before he spoke, saw the way he could not maintain eye contact with her, saw the tension in his shoulders that told her the answer before any words emerged. He did not deny that something catastrophic was unfolding, did not offer the reassurances she desperately needed to hear, did not promise that everything would be fine if they just remained united against external pressures. Instead, he touched her hand briefly with fingers that felt cold and distant, telling her that there were forces and institutional pressures that even a king could not simply command away, that institutions had their own momentum and requirements that superseded personal desires and individual happiness. Her composure, which had served her well through years of public scrutiny and private humiliation, cracked visibly in that moment, and Charles saw fear in her eyes that broke his heart even as he remained unable to prevent what was coming. She understood before receiving explicit confirmation, understood that the life she had built and the position she had fought decades to secure were being taken from her through mechanisms she could not fight or appeal to, that the same institution which had eventually accepted her presence had now decided she had become a liability that needed to be neutralized. The section concluded with a simple but devastating observation that she knew the crown was slipping away from her, and that this time, unlike all previous crises she had survived through determination and Charles's protection, she could not stop what was happening because the threat came not from public opinion or media criticism, but from the institutional structures that actually controlled who held power and who held merely titles. And those structures had decided that her time in any position of influence had come to its end, regardless of what she or Charles wanted or believed they had earned through years of service. The choice Charles never wanted to make. Charles found himself alone in his study once again late at night, drawn back compulsively to the letter that had destroyed his peace and shattered whatever illusions he had maintained about his power as king being real rather than ceremonial. He read it again from beginning to end, no longer searching for ambiguities he might have missed or loopholes that would allow him to protect Camilla without damaging the monarchy, but simply forcing himself to fully absorb and accept the reality of his impossible situation. The demand was stated with perfect clarity, in language that allowed no room for creative interpretation or justified delay. Camilla's role and influence must be systematically reduced until she held her title in name only while actual power and meaningful responsibilities were quietly transferred to others. And Charles himself must be the one to implement these changes personally, demonstrating his loyalty to the institution over his personal attachments in ways that would be visible to those who mattered, even if invisible to the general public. The alternative to compliance was laid out with equal and terrifying clarity, spelled out in terms that left no doubt about the catastrophic consequences of resistance or refusal. The letter indicated that failure to act appropriately and promptly would result in the documented evidence being released through carefully selected channels that would ensure maximum public attention and damage, that the story would be framed not as Charles being forced into difficult choices by institutional pressure, but as him and Camilla having deliberately deceived the British public and broken solemn agreements that had been conditions of her acceptance. The damage would be immediate and potentially terminal for the monarchy as an institution, raising fundamental questions about whether a royal family that could not maintain basic integrity and honesty deserved continued public support, providing powerful ammunition to abolitionists who argued that the monarchy was an expensive anachronism with no legitimate place in modern democratic Britain. Charles understood that the people who had sent this letter were fully prepared to destroy the monarchy he had been raised to protect if that destruction was necessary to enforce institutional accountability and to establish precedents about the limits of royal immunity from consequences. Charles sat with his head in his hands, physically ill, as he weighed considerations that balanced love against legacy against institutional survival. He thought about his decades-long fight to marry Camilla, about the patience and suffering they had both endured while waiting for acceptance that never came willingly, but had to be extracted through years of strategic public relations and gradual normalization of their relationship. He thought about what his reign would be remembered for centuries from now, whether he wanted to be known as the king who defended his wife against unjust institutional demands at the cost of the monarchy's survival, or as the king whose personal stubbornness triggered a constitutional crisis that permanently weakened or even ended the institution. He thought about the long line of monarchs stretching back centuries who had faced impossible choices between personal happiness and institutional duty, and about how many of them had chosen duty precisely because they understood that the crown was larger and more important than any individual who temporarily wore it. Flashbacks to Edward VIII's abdication crisis filled his mind with particular intensity, that historical precedent having shaped Charles's entire understanding of royal duty from his earliest childhood. He had been taught repeatedly and explicitly that Edward's choice to marry Wallis Simpson rather than remain king had been romantic but ultimately selfish, that it had placed personal desire above responsibility to nation and empire, that it had been a fundamental failure of character disguised as noble romance that brought shame to the royal family. Charles had internalized those lessons thoroughly, spending his entire life believing that duty must always triumph over personal desire. And yet he had also fought harder and longer than any previous heir to keep the woman he loved in his life, believing that eventually he would accumulate enough institutional power to protect her absolutely and permanently. The letter sitting on his desk proved that belief had been completely naive, that institutional power operated according to rules and precedents that individual will could never overcome, that even a king was ultimately a servant of forces far larger and older than himself. He made his decision in the dark hours before dawn, a choice that felt inevitable even as it tore something fundamental inside him that would never heal or be whole again. By choosing the crown over Camilla, he was accepting that his life's great romantic struggle had been for nothing, that all the sacrifices and battles and years of patience had led ultimately to this moment where he would personally destroy what he had fought so hard to protect. The decision would not be announced through official channels or public statements, because the entire point was handling the situation quietly and avoiding the spectacle that open conflict would create. Charles would implement the required changes through thousands of small actions and decisions, through schedules adjusted and duties reassigned, through subtle signals that palace staff and advisors would understand and respond to without needing explicit instructions that could be documented or later challenged. The section ended with a meditation on cost and loss, noting that by choosing the crown, Charles had sacrificed not just Camilla's position, but his own illusions about what power really meant and what his life had been for, understanding now that he would wear the crown for the rest of his life, while knowing that its weight was measured not in gold or jewels, but in everything personal and human he had given up to keep it on his head, and that no amount of duty or legacy could ever truly compensate for what he was about to lose. How reigns end without abdication. The mechanisms through which Camilla's power would be removed were refined and elegant, designed by people with centuries of institutional experience in managing precisely these kinds of delicate situations without creating public spectacles or constitutional crises. Her reign as queen consort would end not through dramatic announcement or formal removal of titles, but through systematic reduction of everything that gave those titles practical meaning, leaving her with ceremonial position while stripping away the substance that made position valuable. There would be no single moment that historians could point to as the definitive end of her influence, no specific date when she stopped being queen consort in any meaningful sense, because the process was designed to be gradual enough that it could be denied or minimized, even as everyone directly involved understood exactly what was happening and why. The implementation plan developed by Charles and his most trusted advisors unfolded in carefully calibrated steps, each one defensible individually through plausible explanations, while collectively painting an unmistakable picture of diminishment and marginalization. Camilla's participation in state functions would be gradually reduced through scheduling conflicts and health concerns that were never quite serious enough to raise alarm, but frequent enough to establish a pattern of absence. Other members of the royal family would step forward to assume duties she had previously performed, with palace communications presenting these changes as natural evolution of responsibilities rather than as punishment or removal. Invitations to important meetings and strategy sessions would be withdrawn through quiet bureaucratic means, with her exclusion never announced, but simply implemented through calendar management and access restrictions that operated beneath the level of public visibility. The language used in official palace communications and public statements would be adjusted by professional communications staff who understood how to signal institutional messages through subtle shifts in phrasing and emphasis. References to joint decision-making and partnership would disappear from speeches and press releases, replaced by language that focused on the king's individual authority and leadership. Camilla's name would appear less frequently in official documents, mentioned secondarily if at all, creating the impression through accumulated absence that she was less central to palace operations than previous public presentations had suggested. These changes would happen slowly enough that no single alteration would seem significant, but the cumulative effect over weeks and months would fundamentally reshape public perception of her role and importance. Behind the scenes, the structural changes would be even more dramatic and consequential than the public-facing adjustments, systematically dismantling the networks of influence and access that Camilla had carefully built over years of patient work. Staff assignments would be reorganized so that fewer people reported directly to her, so that her requests and preferences carried diminishing weight in determining how palace operations were conducted, so that she became progressively more isolated from the actual mechanisms through which decisions were made and implemented. Her access to sensitive information would be restricted through new security classifications and need-to-know protocols that excluded her from briefings and discussions she would previously have attended as a matter of course. The private secretaries and advisors who had served as her eyes and ears within the broader palace structure would be reassigned to other duties, or would find their own positions subtly undermined, breaking apart the informal networks through which she had maintained awareness and influence. The section explained how someone could continue being called Queen Consort in every official context, while being systematically excluded from anything that gave that title practical significance beyond ceremonial appearances. The British establishment had developed sophisticated expertise over centuries in managing exactly these situations, removing problematic figures from positions of influence without creating the public drama that formal removal would generate. They understood that most people paid attention to titles and public appearances, rather than to the bureaucratic mechanisms that actually determined who held real power. That public perception could be maintained through careful management, even while underlying reality was fundamentally restructured. Camilla would still appear at carefully selected events, would still be photographed beside Charles at state occasions, would still technically hold her position. But everyone within the system would understand that she had been neutered, that her opinions no longer mattered, that she existed now as decoration rather than as participant in the institution she had fought so hard to enter.